Well, thanks for coming out to hear me, and I'm appreciative of the opportunity to chat with everybody, and it's a humbling experience to be introduced the way Phil does. But I do like to talk about some of the things I've done, not necessarily all of them. I'm not going to preach about what I think makes a good entrepreneur or how to run a business. Instead, I'm just going to tell some stories about what I did. Hopefully you'll be able to pull some things out of that are useful, with the exception of this slide. So I do think these are some of the characteristics that it takes to have a good business, especially when you start from scratch. And I'm fond of saying that businesses are a dime a dozen, but good ones are hard to find. And these are the sort of things that I have found that are key to being able to build a business from scratch. There has to be a hook, some edge, something that you can exploit to get going. You do need vision, and that's something I didn't excel at early on and got better at over time. I believe that entrepreneurship is in your blood. And I don't mean that it's in your genetics, because it doesn't have to be, and in most cases I don't think it is. It's more like a virus, and you get the virus, and once it's in your blood, now you have to deal with it. Sometimes it makes us sick, sometimes it doesn't, but I think you either have it or you don't. I come from a long line of entrepreneurs. As far back as I know our family history, we were entrepreneurs. And as far back as I personally experienced our history, which is my grandparents, we were all entrepreneurs. This is my mother's dad. His name was Willie C. Brownie. And at the time this picture was taken, it was 1901 in downtown Dallas. Notice there are dirt streets and no sidewalks. He was 19. He'd already been a cowboy on the King Ranch for 5 years. He once told me that other than what he spent on tack, he still had every dollar he made cowboying. He worked his way north to a little town near Portales, New Mexico, bought 1,400 acres with that money he'd saved up, and he ranched and farmed for the rest of his life. I spent my summers when I was a kid down on his ranch and the farms and ranches of my other relatives down there, and I loved it down there. I loved driving the tractor and shooting the .22 and chasing rabbits and working the siphon tubes to irrigate, but I also loved electronics. And so I was kind of schizophrenic already. Even by the time I was 9 or 10, I was enthralled by electronics. When I would see a piece of electronic gear go by and I'd see the tubes in the back, I would have a strong physiological response. I'd just almost faint. I now recognize that was an orgasm. But at the time, I didn't know that. And so I went back and forth between these two worlds. My other grandfather didn't like to be dirty and was upfront about that, so he was never a farmer. He sold life insurance. And he wound up starting a life insurance company, an underwriter called Guarantee Reserve Life, which he built up. And it was a pretty big deal in the West in the 40s and 50s, 30s and 40s. And he sold it in the 50s. He also founded Eastern New Mexico University. My dad and two of his brothers had a giant commercial laundry. It was full city block, 2 stories high. They had the contract from the military bases, the Indian reservation, and all the hospitals. And it was a pretty big deal. But the brothers bickered and their wives all bickered. And it got to be a toxic environment. My dad and mom's split off, went to Colorado to save their sanity, and he never, again, wanted anything to do with running a business. So I don't know if it's because that soured him on it or entrepreneurship just really wasn't in his blood, but he wanted that paycheck every 2 weeks. He wanted the assurance he was going to be able to take care of his family, and he never took another risk. He never bought a stock, he never gambled, he never took a drink. So he's very different than I turned out to be. Maybe the genes skipped a generation. But I did learn to work early. I had all these jobs. I had every crappy job you can have. And the older I got, the tougher they got. Is there anybody here that actually knows what bucking bales is? All right. So you have a hay hook in each hand, you grab the bale of hay and throw it up on the wagon. A couple of summers of that and you're ready to play football. It's tough stuff. So it was carrying sides of beef in out of refrigerated trucks into the supermarket. Best job I ever had was once I turned 16, I could work at McDonald's and made $1.06 an hour. But it was actually a good job. First business I ever started was a rock band. And I did it mostly so I could meet women without having to dance. And at first we called ourselves the Acoustics, and we played at high school dances and we made $60 a night, and it was okay. And then I got the idea of having our own dances. And there was a big old Quonset building in the city park that used to be an armory during World War II. Big ugly thing, but it was big. And so I got the idea we could rent that place and have our own dances. We could charge whatever we wanted to charge. So we paid $65, rented the place for the night. My mom and dad took the tickets at the door. We put posters all over town on all the telephone poles, charged $1 a head, packed more than 1,000 kids in the first night. So we went from $60 a night to $1,000 a night just by becoming entrepreneurs. And that's a lesson that I've never forgotten. We had a great run for a couple of months, and the city council started getting on our because they thought we were, this word had not been invented yet, but disenfranchising the kids that couldn't afford it. And they thought we were taking advantage of the ones that could. $1 was a lot. And they launched this war in the newspaper, and we were the Antichrist because we were doing all this terrible stuff. And they wanted us to charge no more than a dime, or they weren't going to rent us the venue. So we thought about that, got pretty down the mouth, and I decided that we should double the price. So we charged $2, put up new posters all over town, and my thinking was if enough kids came and paid $2, then I could go argue $1's not a hardship, right? If that many kids will pay $2, $1's got to be okay. So I was really setting it up so we could negotiate back to $1. Funny thing happened, twice as many kids came to the dance. And they started coming from 60 miles away to go to the dances. And we've got now 2,000 to 2,500 kids in there at $2 a head. That's $5,000 a night. We had to hire armed guards to go with my mom and dad to their car because they were carrying all that cash in fishing tackle boxes. And we did this for 1.5 years, and we were living high as high school kids, making each like $1,000 a week. That was big money. And this is 1963 or $4. So you got to bring that forward by what, a factor of 5 or 10 into today's dollar. So it was a pretty big deal. And this was at a time when my dad was a GS-16 or 18 in charge of all data processing for the Atomic Energy Commission, and he was making $16,000 a year. So that was great, and we got the city council to back off until about halfway through our senior year when they followed through and they shut us down. And we were back to playing at school dances for $60 a night. And that was my first real experience of a crash, and it was difficult to deal with. I'm going to leave out a whole lot of stuff, but we decided to go to Los Angeles as soon as we graduated. So we did. We played at the high school dance. We carried our stuff to the train. We went to LA. Got on the California Zephyr at 3:30 in the morning. And that was one of the most exciting times in my life. We were young. We were on top of our game. Everything was possible. We were going to the big city. We were going to the center of the universe for music. There's nothing better. Until we got on the train and we put our feet up and we got to thinking, well, where are we going to stay? And I'm wondering how much apartments cost and how are we going to get from the train station to where are we going to stay and how far is Hollywood and where are the clubs? We didn't know anything. It was a tough time for a while. We wound up working in a plastic pipe factory, cutting weeds and breaking down cardboard boxes. But eventually, we did break into the entertainment scene on Sunset Strip. We rotated from there were only about 6 clubs that counted, and we rotated among those clubs, and we got back to where we were making $1,000 a night a piece. But now we were working 6 days a week, and that was pretty good money. That was more than $25,000 a month. And that was, we were sure we were going to get a recording contract. We thought our future was laid out for us. On the same day, we all got our draft notices. We were all members of the same draft board, so our folks called the same day and said, you have a week to be in Denver and take the physical. So that ended the why not run. We did go back to Colorado. We got into school quickly. We got 2 S deferments. But playing for dances at $60 a night after that was just so depressing that we began to tear each other apart. Pretty soon the band broke up. But I did use that money to buy a Cessna 206, 3 Corvettes that I raced in SCCA. I tooled around in a Porsche. We were living high. That's a current 206. And if you look in the lower right corner, they sell for $600,000 today. That's about right. I think I paid $68,000 for mine in 1965. So that just shows you how far down the dollar has gone. In college, I flew kids up to Aspen. I had a commercial pilot's license. I got it the day I turned 18. And I charged them $100 a head to fly up to Aspen and back. And I had a job playing in that club right there. I found this shot on the internet just the other day. A club called Galena Street East. And that was the hottest venue in Aspen, maybe the hottest venue in Colorado. And the first time I went up there, after I was in college, I went in, the owner saw me, and he remembered us because our band had played there. And he said, how's the band? And I said, well, we broke up. He said, well, that's too bad, but you were never right for this place. You were too loud anyway. And I said, yeah. So he came around about an hour later, and he said, but listen, why don't you come up, do an acoustic guitar, solo thing, sing folk songs and protest songs and songs with a message, and that's what everybody wants to hear. This is 66, 67. And business is good, so I can pay you a lot of money. My ears perked up. And he said, I can pay you $200 a night. And since you don't have to split it with anybody, that's a lot of money. But now I knew how it worked because I'd been on Sunset Strip. I said, I'll do it, but I want 50% of the gate, 20% of the bar. And he looked at me like I was about to kidnap his kids. And I think the real problem was that I understood how it worked, and I wasn't supposed to, right? So he came back later and he said 15%. So we did. So for the next 3 years, I worked there every weekend during the ski season, about 4.5 months. Occupancy limit was 160, and I routinely packed 250, 270 people in. He charged $5 at the door usually, and I was back to making $1,000 a night, playing twice a week was all. So throughout college, I made about, in the summertime, I picked up what charters I could of my 206 and played minor league baseball, which paid nothing. And all told, I was making about $60,000 a year. So if you bring that forward today into today's dollars, it's like sending my kid to college and he starts making $400,000 a year working weekends. Yeah. I mean, that was a great gig. And I did not get back to that level for many years after that. These are the dead years. These are, I graduated from college with an electrical engineering degree, always planned to. Went to work for Hughes Aircraft. I thought I'd design air-to-air missiles and advanced radar. And their idea of what a young engineer does is check other people's work for the first 5 or 10 years. No design authority at all. Terrible job. I got to live in Newport Beach. I liked that. I stayed 3 years. I should have stayed 3 days. But I was having fun in Newport Beach, plenty of girls to chase. surfing, I learned to sail, all great stuff. Some guy about 3 levels higher than me in the organization quit, went to Ball Brothers Research in Boulder, Colorado, also an aerospace company, small one, and called me one day and he said, so we need a design engineer to do the analog control system for this attitude control system for an extra atmospheric suborbital sounding rocket. You interested? I said, chance to design something? Of course. So I was there instantaneously. Great project, loved it. That was fun. But I hated Boulder. Boulder has always been politically liberal. Well, actually it hadn't always been, but then it was becoming very liberal politically. So all my peers were on the left, and they were anti-war, anti-capitalism, anti-money, anti-the man. And all the people I worked with tended to have crook guts and be conservative politically. And each side hated me because I was associating with the other side. And so I felt really torn. And this led to the only epiphany I've ever had in my life. And I still remember it. Oh, by the way, after I was paid $10,400 a year at Hughes. And in that same era, you may remember they jacked up the insurance rates on muscle cars. So I had a '69 Dodge Charger with a 440 and a 6-pack. And I had paid $5,500 for it straight from the factory, ordered just the way I wanted, and the insurance went up to that. And so I could no longer afford it. So now, by the end of 4 years of that, all my toys were gone. The 206 was gone, the cars were gone. I had a white Dodge van, 6-cylinder. It had an overstuffed chair in the back, and my girlfriend put paisley curtains on the windows. And I was sitting in my white Dodge van at a stoplight when I was just flooded with thoughts, which I call an epiphany now. And that was that I wanted to be rich. I'd had a taste of it. I knew I wanted to be rich. I'd always wanted to start an electronics company or own one. And I was tired of hiding from it and having to associate with people that looked down on that and apologize for it or not admit it to myself. So I embraced that that's what I wanted. And I didn't care whether my friends thought it was a good thing or not. Heck with it. Then I realized that I had no clue how to go about doing any of that. I didn't know how to start an electronics company. I didn't have any ideas for products. I didn't know how to market them. I didn't know how startups were financed. I realized I'd wasted 4 years of my career in the aerospace industry. So I committed myself to building an electronics career that would lead me to a point where I could start a company. I went back to the office and told this guy I worked with about my epiphany. And your epiphany is always funny to me. Mine was to him. He was about 15 years older than I was. And he said, so you're going to go to Silicon Valley and you're going to set it on fire, right? I said, yeah. He says, how are you going to do that? You don't know how to design integrated circuits. And that's what they do in Silicon Valley. You're a system engineer. I said, well, there's that, you know. He asked me what my favorite job in the world would be, and I thought, and I said it would be to be an applications engineer at National Semiconductor because they have the best parts. They have this genius guy named Weidler that knows more about analog circuitry than anybody. They're the hottest company in Silicon Valley. I love their app notes. I've learned so much from their app notes. That would be an ideal job for me. He says, funny thing, my best friend runs application engineering at National Semi. Want me to make a call? So he made a call, and I became an application engineer at National Semi around 1974. I wrote app notes. I got the first look at the new parts. I got to be creative about how to use the new parts and then go out and teach the customers and write app notes about them. It was great because I didn't actually have to turn them into products, which is hard work. I just skimmed the cream off the top and took credit for all the creative part. I went on the internet the other day and found this app note written in 1974 by me. It's still alive and well on the internet. And it actually defines the way to build oscillators with CMOS circuits that is still used today. The microcontroller I'm using in my latest product uses the same techniques. And so this was a great job, and that was one of the app notes that I wrote. But the important part of going to national was that it was my first successful company. I'd never really been in a successful entrepreneurial company. And I was too late to be a part of building national. I mean, it was already hot before I got there. So don't take anything away from this, and I'm taking any credit for national's success. But I met the guys that did build the company. And I'd never seen such an aggressive group of guys. People ran between meetings. They didn't do that at Hughes Aircraft. And they didn't do it because somebody expected them to. They did it because they wanted to get the most done they could every day. So they would work to the last instant, then run 3 buildings over to a meeting, and then they'd run back. Everybody had stock options. Everybody had a vested interest in the success of the company. I was surrounded by guys that were multimillionaires. So these are the founders of National Semi. All the semiconductor companies are spin-offs of Fairchild, and all these guys are ex-Fairchild folks. Anyway, that's Charlie Spork. He was the CEO. Pierre Lamond, an incredibly arrogant Frenchman, PhD physicist from MIT, tough as nails. I've seen him make 45-year-old professional engineers cry in meetings. Very tough. Fred Bialak ran a division called Data Checker, which was one of the first point-of-sale systems. And that's Don Valentine. Anybody here heard of Don Valentine? Sequoia Capital. He became probably the best venture capitalist in the business, and Sequoia today is still the toughest and best venture capitalist. But I learned things from other people that weren't at National. Jerry Sanders had been at Fairchild, just like all these guys had. And when they spun off and started National, Jerry Sanders wanted to go and be the sales guy. And as the story goes, Charlie Spork sat him down and said, "Jerry, I think it's time you start your own company," which was code for, "You're such a jerk, we don't want you here." Because he was the most boisterous, braggadocio, loud guy you could ever meet. One of the most aggressive sales personalities you've ever run across. So he did. He started AMD, Advanced Micro Devices. So one day we were at lunch, I was with my boss, some other people, and Jerry Sanders is there. We all wind up at the same table. And Jerry Sanders held court. And that's exactly what it was. He spoke the whole time, nobody else spoke. And he told us all about the greatest parts they had recently, and they were all better than Nationals, of course. And they were based on a new improvement in the process, semiconductor process, which was rubbing our nose in it because National Semi did not innovate in process technology by choice. And then he told us about all the big accounts he'd won, DEC and IBM and on and on. And we left that meeting and I said to Dale, "My gosh, that's the biggest jerk I've ever met. You know, he didn't do anything but brag the whole lunch." And Dale stopped me and he said, "Look, he wasn't bragging. If he just said, 'I won IBM,' and didn't say anything about how he did it, that would have been bragging. But that was a success story. He told you how it was done. In fact, he just laid out for you how to win in Silicon Valley. Innovate in the process, have better, faster parts, win the big accounts." He said, "Without success stories, we'd all be shooting in the dark. None of us would know how to do this. We'd always be reinventing the wheel and experimenting. There's nothing more important to Silicon Valley than success stories." And he said to me, "That's the most important hour you've ever spent in your life." And that was when I learned the value of success stories. So that's what I hope some of today is, that there's a little bit in these stories that people can use. Pierre Lamond, the arrogant Frenchman, wanted to be CEO, but Charlie Spork wasn't going anywhere, so he took a job as the CEO of Coherent Radiation. There were 2 laser companies at that time, Spectrophysics and Coherent. And Jim Hobart started Coherent, but every couple of years the board would get antsy and decide he wasn't doing a good enough job running the company. They'd bring in some business guy, After a year or two of messing it up, they threw him out and made Jim CEO again. So we were in this phase where they wanted an outside CEO, so they brought in Pierre. And shortly after Pierre got there, IBM showed up at their doorstep and said, guys, we need your help. We've invented this thing called a universal product code. It's barcode. And we've gotten the United Grocers Association to make all their members put it on their packaging. And now we can't build a scanner that will read it. And so we're in a jam. Surely you guys can, the laser guys. They went to Spectre and Coherent. But the problem was that IBM had electronics expertise, no optics and physics. The laser companies had physicists and optical guys and mechanical guys and no electronics. So Pierre immediately thought of me. And I guess I was overly modest. When I was at National, I did develop a reputation for being able to solve problems nobody else could solve, and I was extremely fast. So Pierre thought of me. And he came, he told me the problem. He said, if you can think of a way to do this, we'll bring you over to Coherent, give you a chunk of the company, and we'll build scanners. So that's what I did. And it sounds a lot easier than it really was. Let me back up. So I won't go into why or how I did it differently or why it wasn't being done before. Anybody wants to talk about that offline, I'd be happy to. But I do remember that I had it done, it should be working, it wasn't working. And so I took a turntable, a 16 RPM turntable, and I glued a board to it, and I stuck a label on the end of it, UPC code label. And I just had it going around like this over the window of the scanner. And it was set up so it made a long beep if it didn't read it and a short beep if it did. And I'm laying there on the ground in the middle of the night looking up into the guts of this thing, tweaking things, looking at the oscilloscope. And it's 2 a.m. and I'm tired. And I remember leaning back, slumping on the floor and saying, I think I'm done for the day. And I realized it was giving short beeps. And I don't know how long it had been doing it. I was so used to it for days, it had been making long beeps. It could have been making little beeps, short beeps for an hour, I don't know. So I jumped up and looked at the readout. It was the right number. I tried a whole bunch of other labels. So I called Jim Hobart and Pierre Lamont in the middle of the night. And I'm one of the few guys in the world that has the guts to call Pierre Lamont in the middle, or is stupid enough to call Pierre Lamont in the middle of the night. Told him it was working. So Jim comes down with a bottle of champagne. Pierre came down in his pajamas with his robe on. I couldn't believe it. And we sat, well, Jim Hobart, the physicist, tried to fool the scanner. He tried holding the labels every which way, and in their worst case, and wrapped around round objects and things like that. And it works. So we had a nice chuckle and a drink of champagne. Pierre Lamont leans over to me and he says, Mike, all the bullshit aside, this is what it's like. This is what it's about. All the other stuff is just the stuff that happens, but this is what counts. Isn't this better than sex? And I was 27 or something. I remember thinking, are you out of your mind? But that was my first high-tech win where I really built something that worked and counted. I made some money. There's the patent on the barcode scanner. Now they're everywhere. That's a picture of the scanner in a checkout counter at a trade show for point-of-sale systems. And that was a Data Checker, was a brand of point-of-sale system made by National Semiconductor. And noticed all the different kinds of groceries. They picked the ones they thought would be the impossible ones to read and tested it. It was good enough so that I was able to buy a nice house. And Woodside is like the Beverly Hills of the Bay Area, or Malibu or something, large estates. And it worked out fine. I did some, well, but the scanner market was slow to take off. We had opposition from the consumer union and from the retail clerks union. Ralph Nader thought that all the stores were going to rip us off between the shelf and checkout, change the price in the machine, all that sort of thing. So it was slow. I was frustrated. Jim Hobart tried to find other projects for me to work on, and I was irascible, or anyway. So finally Jim sat me down and he said, Mike, I'm not sure there's anybody you can work with anymore. And I realized that was my time to leave. That was the end of my career as an employee. And from that point on, I was unemployable, which a lot of entrepreneurs are. And so I left the company. Did some consulting. Found myself at the Stanford Linear Accelerator for at the Homebrew Computer Club meetings. This was a couple hundred guys got together. This had to be 76, 5, something like that, and built their own computers. And I think that's a guy I'm going to talk about a little bit later, a jerk named Jeff Raskin. And I usually sat about here near the front, by the front door, and noticed some of them were turned around listening to whatever he's saying, which was no doubt obnoxious. He had a newsletter at the time and was kind of the resident know-it-all. One night, two Steves brought a single board computer, and at the time, personal computers such as they existed looked like this. They had a bus, a card cage. This was called the S100 bus. And you built a computer by plugging in a processor board, some memory boards, some I/O boards, and that sort of thing. And so these two Steves, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, brought in a single board computer that had everything you needed on one board. And they presented it, and they wanted to sell them for $666 in kit form. So for $666, you got that wood thing, a bag of parts, and the board. And precious little documentation. So it wasn't very well received. Nobody got too excited about it. The big conversation of the night turned out to be about memory. And this guy stood up and he said, these dynamic memory boards are being marketed for the S100 bus computers. Don't buy them. They're flaky. They won't work. There are two kinds of memory, static and dynamic. Static's easy to design with, inherently reliable, draws more power, costs more money. Dynamic's the other. Oh, I only got 10 left? Okay. There was a big argument about dynamic memory. I bet a guy I could make one. I did. That's it. I launched a company called Dynabyte. On the basis of that, we made a bunch of S100 bus computers, boards for them, and then the computers, we sold these small business and industrial computing systems. And this is remarkable. They're collectible. That's right now. $3,000 for an old Dynabyte computer. They're into what the labels say. Look at this. Collectible S100 boards right at the top. Dynabyte static memory. Even the manuals bring $130. That's today. Okay. We also had a control computer. Sold the company for about $50 million, but it was a bittersweet deal because we wanted to be compact. These are some of the guys that were on my board. They were the who's who of Silicon Valley, and they didn't buy the whole PC deal. So we proposed going out raising $10 million and cloning the IBM PC. They couldn't support it. They just didn't get it. For many years I've been angry at those guys, but in the end the fault was mine because I did not have sufficient conviction in my vision. I should have found a way to do it, whether I had to do it around them or over them, steamroll them, whatever, but I didn't. So when these big guys I was starstruck with said, well, we think you're nuts, I said, well, I must be nuts. And sold the company, and Compaq did it. So the lesson is really that. You need a vision, you need your investors to share that vision, and don't ever believe they know more about your market than you know about your market. If you're doing something sufficiently innovative, you're ahead of them. You're way out in front of the market research firms and your investors. You're the one that knows what's going on. And I failed in that regard. So it was nice. I got all these nice things out of it, except maybe the divorce. But I was always bittersweet. And I found myself sitting on the beach in Santa Barbara. She got everything. She got the horse ranch in Santa Barbara. And I was wondering if any woman would ever be interested in a 40-year-old guy that was broke. And I started a company because I saw the consumer electronics industry and the PC coming together. I was convinced we were going to watch television on the PC, or the PC was going to wind up in the TV. Making a long story short, we developed all the DVR technology. I have the patent on the on-screen TV guide, the patent on clicking on one of the entries in the guide and having the machine record the program, and a lot of other things that haven't even been implemented yet. And these are a bunch of those patents. We came out of there with 25, 28 patents. But I was really too early. It was a very difficult business model. So I sold the company to a long-term player, Intel. Small deal, $10 million, but I hadn't raised any venture capital, so it was just me and a couple of key employees. And I was happy to be out because I thought it was going to be a long, ugly road, and it was. Last time I looked, TiVo had gone through $800 million of investment capital and hadn't earned a dime. So I felt lucky to get out. We went sailing. Took the family. We spent 3 years cruising the Caribbean. What self-respecting ham radio operator would leave the dock without a kilowatt amp? This is called Cafe Sport. It's in Horta. It's de rigueur when you sail across the Atlantic, which I did in '99 with my middle son and 2 friends, that you stop at this cafe. It has been that way for 150 years. You put your flag on the wall. My flag is on the ceiling there, but you can't see it very well. Here you can just barely see an American flag, the bottom of it hanging that way. That's us. This is their official photo on their website right now today, and right there is our flag. And if this was a good enough picture, you can see we wrote the boat name Taz and the name of the crew on it, and it's still there. That's my son Matt catching a tuna in the Caribbean somewhere. We have a place on St. Martin. That's the view. That's our wives having a drink while we do this, which is standing in the jet blast right behind the jetliners when they take off. And that's what they look like when they're coming in, and it's fun to stand there right there. That's our boat in the middle of the Atlantic on the Atlantic crossing. We went to Europe. We spent a couple years in Europe. We cruised around Spain, France, Italy, the Balearics. That's just to prove we were there. But they have winter in Europe, so we spent the winters in Switzerland skiing, something I'd always wanted to do. That's us going up there. My daughter went to last few years of high school and Swiss boarding school. She's supposed to be studying. She's watching TV. Middle son, older son. Long story short, came back, ran across an opportunity to buy a bankrupt armored vehicle maker in Charleston, South Carolina called Technical Solutions Group. And my buddy and I did buy it for $600,000. They had a vehicle called the Buffalo at the time, and we're on the old Navy base. You can see the crummy building. And a vehicle called the Cougar. That is a much later refined version of the Cougar, which got renamed to be MRAP, the Mine-Resistant Ambush Protected Vehicle. I thought, well, the founder of the company had been bankrupt twice. Third time he went bankrupt, we bought the company. His vision was to sell a few dozen of these a year for mine clearance to the Corps of Engineers. My vision was to sell thousands of them and make it a major tactical vehicle in Iraq. I thought if we could defeat the IEDs, we could change the course of the war. That's why we bought the company. We did, in fact, do that. These are those vehicles. Has a V-shaped hull, which helps channel the blast off to the sides. But there's a whole story about how it happened, because the DoD did not want to buy these vehicles. And there were a whole long list of reasons. We're not going to have a 21st prime contractor. If we were, it wouldn't be for a manned vehicle. The TACOM Tank Command in Detroit rules that space with an iron fist to your mandatory testing cycle. On and on, a big list. I had 58 generals tell me there was no way in hell, their word, that they were ever going to buy that vehicle from us. But I made a bunch of friends. They invited me to the Marine Corps dinner in Washington. Great affair. The Commandant gave a great speech at dinner, much like this, round tables. I heard a guy on the other side say to the fellow next to him, "But we hate to let the Israelis get out in front of us." And it clicked, and that was my hook. All I had to do was get the Israelis to buy one or two, and then the Marines wouldn't be able to stand it, and they'd have to come buy it. Okay? And that's exactly what I did. Long story about how we made it happen, but I finally got to the head of the Israeli mission, and I told him my story, a guy named Avner Devash, and he says, "It's very interesting, Mike, but why are you telling me?" I said, "Avner, I want you to buy one or two, and I'll make you a hell of a deal, and in a few years when they're used up, I might even buy them back. But I'm sure somewhere in Israel you need one or two of these. And I would like you to say something to the Marines about the fact you're buying our vehicles." So he chuckles. He has me back 6 weeks later, and we go in, he lays out a bunch of drawings, and it's a vehicle. And it bears no resemblance to anything we've ever built. He goes through it, spends an hour on it. At the end of it, it's my turn. I say, "Avner, why are you telling me all this?" He says, "Because I want you to enter the competition. We put this out to bid, and only one bidder showed up, Textron. And they're trying to rape us, Michael." He grabbed me by the shoulder. "They're trying to rape us. They want $760,000 for a vehicle that should cost $240,000. So I want you to build a prototype and enter this competition. Now, I can't give you the contract because you don't meet any of the financial requirements, and I can't pay you for the vehicle. You'll have to pay for it. But we will seriously evaluate it." So I called my partner Frank and said, "Man, you got to raise $100,000 a week in the penny stock market for the next 5 weeks while we build this thing by hand." I flew a dozen South Africans up that know how to build these things. They built it from scratch. Didn't meet any of the specs, but it was there. The Israelis did their part. They evaluated it. They mentioned it to the Marines, and pretty soon the Marines were at our doorstep. Did a couple of other things that are important lessons. I found out our guys are not creative. One Marine went through it, wasn't impressed. I said, "What don't you like?" He said, "Well, this would be a great vehicle, but the seats face the wrong way." And they're used to being told, "Here's what you get, be happy with it." And as I said, "We can change the seats. How do you want the seats?" And he said, "You can?" So we built wood mock-ups, one that was correct on the inside, one that was correct on the outside. We'd incorporate the Marines' feedback, have them back a week later. After about 6 cycles of that, they thought it was their vehicle. They loved it. It was just the way they wanted it. They felt ownership, and now they wanted the vehicle. But still nothing happened. Finally, I realized they were leaving these meetings saying, "It's too bad those guys don't really have any manufacturing capability because we give them a contract." And we were leaving saying, "I wish those guys would give us a contract. We'd go raise some money and build a factory." So I realized it was a standoff. With 5 weeks of cash left in the bank, I went out and signed a 10-year lease on 250,000 square feet of heavy manufacturing space that I rented from Jerry Zucker, if anybody knows Jerry Zucker. And we painted the lines on the floor, did a multimedia presentation of what the factory flow was going to be. We bought the welding kits, the toolboxes. We got the Marines down, gave them the tour, and guys are welding jigs together, and sparks are flying everywhere. Everybody's smiling. Next morning, we get back together, and the program manager takes me aside and says, "You know, we see what you're doing, Mike. We know this is play acting. We know you really don't have any manufacturing capability, but we get it. You stuck your neck out, and that's something that we, as Marines, respect. So we're going to respond in kind. We're going to stick our necks out. We're going to waive the 2-year mandatory testing cycle, give you a contract for $45 million. We did get Lindsey Graham and Henry Brown's help to get that contract funded. That's what one looks like after it's been blown up by an IED. The biggest injury was a broken wrist. That's what happens when a Humvee hits an IED. Everybody in there was dead. That was an up-armored Humvee. Just a hole in the ground we made. Henry Brown This is where Robert Gates recently stated that the MRAP saved at least 10,000 lives in Iraq and changed the course of the war, and it did. Here are our financials. So in 2002, when we bought the company, that was 10 Cougars sold to the Brits, which were total crap. None of the parts were interchangeable. After a month in Britain, they were rusting. So they were embarrassing. That's the year we bought the company, in the middle of the year, July. This was just some Buffaloes we sold to the Corps of Engineers. And then in 2004, we started getting the contract that I talked about, executed a little bit of it at the end of the year, and then the rest of it. And it quickly went from 45 to 65 million. Here's what the value of $100 invested in our stock versus the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones was worth. By 2006, $2,140 if you invested in our company. And we grew to, during this time, 196 million in sales. This is the 196 million year. Next year was 890 and 1.3 billion. And that's it, right? That's all there is. I have more to say, but he says I'm out of time. Thanks. I hope there's something useful.